and delighted to welcome you to this discussion of the new novel by Roger Scruton, Notes from Underground, published this spring by Beaufort Books. We have, thanks to our friends at Politics and Prose, copies of the book available for sale after the discussion, and our author will take his seat at the rear of the room and sign any copies that are purchased or any copies that people brought along hoping to have him sign. Hudson is delighted to be co-sponsoring this forum with the Common Sense Society, which is an independent educational foundation. It works to promote civic engagement, entrepreneurship, and the virtues of leadership among young people in the United States and in Europe. The president of the Common Sense Society, Marion Smith, is here. I thank him for his help, and also the help of Travis Lacuter, hope I pronounced that correctly, and his colleagues at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Roger Scruton is a visiting professor of philosophy at Oxford, a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center here in Washington. He has had distinguished affiliations with almost every important academic and think tank institution in England and the UK, I should say, and the USA at one point or another in his career. He long ago transcended institutional affiliations of any sort. He is considered part of the family when we can get him at any academic intellectual institution on either side of the Atlantic. He's the author of more than 40 books. I mentioned a few in the notice: Beauty, The Uses of Pessimism. Others favorites of mine are The Aesthetics of Architecture, The Aesthetics of Music, a book on environmentalism. His most recent book, along with the one we're discussing tonight, is The Soul of the World, which Princeton is bringing out just this month. It is a demonstration of the continuing reality of the sacred, even in the face of all of the firm certainties of modern science. It's a wonderful book that Roger would be publishing 2 books in 1 month. Is the latest reminder of the immense prolificacy of this man. I don't know anybody who has written as many books as Roger has who has not written too many. It somehow seems possible for Roger, with his amazing output, to choose every single word, thought, sentence with great care. Every one of his works reflects an immense amount of learning, careful thought, balanced, careful attention, sometimes more care to the attention of his opponents than they have paid themselves, and astoundingly rigorous argumentation on behalf of the ideas that he is advancing. This book that he is discussing this evening is a novel. Notes from Underground is a tale of living in a under a totalitarian state, just when that state is itself collapsing and presenting unexpected new challenges to our protagonists. It is not a conventional story of heroic resistance to oppression. It is a much more interior, layered, I dare say more realistic portrait of the depredations of communism. I could say more, and I will not. I want to mention, as a reason for not saying more, that although I would know how to introduce books by Roger on environmentalism or philosophy or conservatism or aesthetics, one should not say too much before the author speaks. A work of fiction is not something we are accustomed to here at the Hudson Institute. A serious work of fiction, and this is emphatically a serious work of fiction, differs from a serious work of nonfiction in that it emphasizes moral ambiguity and nuance, such as we all experience in our own lives as we lead them. It is therefore open to various interpretations. It is open to being shaped by the subjective understanding of the reader, and therefore it is not a matter for anybody to pronounce on with finality, and we want to hear most of all from Roger himself. But at the same time, I want to warn Roger that for a work of fiction, precisely because it is open to interpretation, because it acquires a life of its own once it is out in the world, it is no longer the exclusive possession of an author, as a work of philosophy or nonfiction or politics might be. Therefore, the author's intentions are interesting and useful, but they are not the last word on the subject. For there are other words to be spoken by people who have read his work, gotten to know the people that he has created and the dilemmas that he has cast in front of them. And we will be hearing from individuals in the room, but first of all from two individuals who themselves has, each in his own way, been an important part of the world that provides the setting for Roger's drama. First and most important, Peter Gandalovic, the Czech ambassador to the United States. The ambassador was, during the mid-1980s, the time in Prague that is the setting of Notes from Underground, a student at Charles University in Prague, studying math and physics, which he was then teaching at a high school at the time of the communist collapse. He attended some demonstrations and ended up being drawn into politics. He was one of the founders of the Civic Forum, the first substantial classical liberal political grouping in 1989 in Prague, and later was one of the co-founders of the offshoot, the Civic Democratic Party, which he served as vice chairman and in other positions. After the ambassador, we will hear from John O'Sullivan, who is director of the Danube Institute in Budapest, which is a center of intellectual debate for classical liberals and their democratic opponents in Central Europe. He is also director of the 21st Century Initiatives in Washington and a senior fellow at the National Review Institute here in Washington. And among his other previous positions, he was for a time vice president and executive editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Prague. With those introductions, we will proceed first to our author, then to our two commenters. We may have a little discussion here, and then we will open it up to comments, questions, and a general discussion with everyone who has come. Roger, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was, as always, a very lucid and rounded introduction, with a bit too flattering to me, but I probably creating, at least setting the tone for what I have to try and live up to. The reason, obviously, for publishing this book now is that we're approaching the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Velvet Revolution, as it's so called, in what was then Czechoslovakia. And as we approached it, this is a year or more ago, I began to think that I really must finally write down my own feelings about it. I've tried many times, it had never worked, but once I'd thought of the title, Notes from Underground, it wrote itself over a period of many months. And of course, it's a bit of a cheat for me to say that I thought of that title, because it was taken from Dostoevsky, as everybody knows. But there's a reason why I chose it, nevertheless, other than the fact that it's such a good one, which is that the hero of this book is himself, who's lost in a kind of underground world of his own. It picks up Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, And it's that very thought that you can actually be underground, away from where everything is going on, and yet find some kind of life, cantankerous life indeed, of your own there, which sets him on his path, I won't say to ruin, but to complexity at least. The book is about the underground in many ways. For a start, it's about the subway in Prague. Jan spends a lot of time travelling around on the subway because he can, as it were, nurse his loneliness there and feel at home with it, and live in a world of fantasy, looking at the other passengers and inventing their lives for them. One of the remarkable things about the communist countries at that time, especially Czechoslovakia, was the silence. People didn't speak to each other, not unless there was absolute necessity, and kept all conversations, even when they were necessary, to a whisper. So sitting there in these silent carriages where only the rattle of the wheels can be heard, stimulated this guy's fantasy into inventing for himself a better world. Finally, someone seems to reach down from that better world to lift him up, and he climbs up, thanks to her, only to discover that he's in another kind of underground, the underground culture and the world of samizdat and unofficial lectures and so on, which is a world that I knew because I was part of it. So, and the relation between these two raises the great question: how do you actually emerge from that catacomb in which he was carrying out his life? He seemed to have arisen into another layer, another level of catacombs, but still the light eluded him. So that is the question underlies the book. And I think it's what I was trying to do was to convey to people how things were at that time. That is to say, how they were phenomenologically, what it was like to be in that world, not a sort of political analysis or an attempt to describe the routines of day-to-day life, although those are important, but simply the smell of things, the touch of things, the way in which somehow the pervading suspicion and distrust was not just something that you saw in the eyes of other people, but you could, as it were, see it dripping on the walls. The whole atmosphere of life was, in an important way, different from the life that you Americans live here. And the story is told from the point of view of America. The hero of the book finally emerges, as everybody does in 1989, into the new freedoms. He ends up teaching in a liberal arts college here in Washington, and looking back at that peculiar world, trying to recreate, repossess its peculiar atmosphere from the day-to-day ordinary atmosphere of a place like Washington, in which there are no real troubles, but everybody is hurrying away from one trouble towards the next in a rather exhilarated way. So in that old atmosphere, there was where things were moved extremely slowly, but human relationships were all important. There was a longing for truth, not just the truth of facts, getting the facts right, knowing history, well, that was important for people, but the truth of the soul, knowing that you were dealing with the truth of another person, which you could never be sure about, because you were always on the edge of things, just as our relations with God are like that. And we get to the edge of our world, and there, beyond it, we see something unfathomable. In that atmosphere, it was like that between people, too. You got to the edge of normality, and you didn't know whether you were consulting the truth or just a great vacuum, or perhaps a betrayal. You saw the other person, as it were, in a vision, which illuminated everything for a moment and then vanished. And there was a sense of the helplessness in the face of this and of the stupidity of everything around you. This guy, Jan, emerges, anyway, thanks to Betka, the woman, strange woman, who liberates him. And he emerges into the underground seminars, and I think I should say just a little bit about that, because that was how I got to know this world, by visiting people who were conducting these seminars underground in order to, first of all, to teach the young people who had been deprived of any right to go to the university because of the political profile of their parents, or whatever, something that had gone wrong, which was, of course, a very noble and honourable thing. But secondly, also to keep alive the memory of the Czech civilization, Czech culture, which was one of the great fragments of European culture which had achieved so much in the 19th and 20th century, and which was not properly conveyed, of course, in the official institutions. So they had grown a kind of underground culture of which these seminars are a part. There was also an underground popular culture, much influenced by what young people had been able to hear and entertain of Western popular music. The Beatles, of course, have been a huge influence. John Lennon, in particular, for his gestures of defiance towards authority, and many young people imagined that something like that could be done in the Czech lands. In particular, a famous pop group called the Plastic People of the Universe, who promptly arrested and whose case became a cause célèbre. Václav Havel, who was then a kind of official dissident, taking it up and himself being imprisoned for 4 or 5 years as a result. In that society, there was a great division between the official and the unofficial dissidents, so to speak. There were dissidents, and this was very true of Poland and Hungary too. There were dissidents who were known in the West, who had spoken out, whose works were translated because they were, in any case, people of international standing, intellectually and artistically. People like Václav Havel, Pavel Kohout, and so on. And around them there were others, including the famous poet, well, famous to Czechs, called Eros or Magor. He wrote under the pseudonym of Magor, and another such poet, Karel Kryl, whose profile was strong enough that they could speak out, and who also risked going to jail, but whose destiny was always heard about in the West. But then there were the unofficial dissidents, people who had not achieved that profile, but nevertheless had lost everything for one reason or another, and in particular those who were expelled from universities following the Soviet invasion in 1968. They had lost their jobs and lost with it all sense of being able to establish an intellectual identity of their own, but still wanted to be intellectuals and to have that sort of the glory, the halo of being a suffering soul casting its light across the ordinary world around. And the Samizdat press grew up as much to cater for the vanity of those unofficial dissidents as to publish the real achievements of the official ones, or the ones that we all know about, the ones who'd done well for themselves in whatever previous incarnation. So there were a lot of jealousies, a lot of competition, as well as this pervading suspicion, and people kept their little circles and so on. So I described that world and tried to invoke both to some extent, the world of the populous underground culture and the world of the serious underground culture, riven by jealousies, but also by the search, the overriding search for love and understanding, which was always there and almost always frustrated because you couldn't trust the other. And there's another aspect of this which I think Czechs today, Peter will perhaps correct me, but Czechs today don't see how important it was, and that was the religious dimension. All the opposition in Eastern Europe had taken a new turn with the election of Pope John Paul II. In other words, a Polish pope thoroughly familiar with the devastation of the soul that communism had set out to achieve, who renewed the message of Christianity, and the message that actually there is no way out of this maze except through embracing the path of sacrifice which Christ had set before us. And many people in Czechoslovakia also heard that message So one of my characters is an underground priest who had broken away from the official collaborating church and written about this and had his own underground congregation. So through him, I try and evoke that very strange world of a highly metaphysical Christianity. Father Pavel, who the character, is much influenced by Simone Weil, the French existentialist theologian, and that sense of living on the edge of things, which she advocated as the only path to salvation. So there's something very, extreme, almost exaggerated in his advocacy of sacrifice. And there were people like that, in particular, the philosopher Václav Benda, who ran an underground seminar of his own and was part of all that. So all that is I try to convey that atmosphere, and one must remember that the Czechs are remarkable for their theatrical tradition. I think it's the most theatrical nation that's ever existed, really. I mean, the theatre was the thing that made the modern Czechoslovakia in the 19th century, well, the modern Czech identity in the 19th century, and it was men of theatre who put the place on the map, people like the two Čapeks, and of course Havel and so on. Right, so there's an element of theatricality in all this as well. And my take on this, I'll just try and summarize it, how I saw that situation, because I think it is really important to us today to remember it. We're entering, as we know, a new period of conflict in Europe, where the sense of that order is imposed from above by a superior power that is unanswerable to people, namely Putin and his henchmen. It is once again making itself felt in Eastern Europe, and people are trembling with the memory of what they went through then and what they had then. What they had then was their private relations, no attempt, nothing that would re-establish public order. So it's important to look back on it. My take is very much that in looking at the Czechs and the Czech nation as it was then, we're looking at a nation that's in a certain sense made by books. Books were tremendously important. This is one reason why we visitors from the West who went to the underground seminars, there weren't very many of us, but why it was so exciting was that having spent however many years in the futile effort of trying to get our students in Britain or France to read books, we suddenly encountered people who actually wanted to read them, and they wanted to read them because they were forbidden. You know, we'd obviously used the wrong method. And here they were, these people assembled in a state of often of fear, knowing that that at any moment the door might be broken open and they'd be taken away for their 48 hours of interrogation. Assembled, nevertheless, with extremely difficult books, prepared to listen to how you would help them to understand them and what those books told them by way of the truth of the human condition and what one must do if you like to be saved. And this, if you look back at the Czech history, you'll see that books have had this importance from the very beginning. It's no accident that the first president of Czechoslovakia after the First World War was a literary man and a philosopher, literary people have had a prominent place ever since. The communists, of course, dumbed everything down, and their politicians were a particularly dumb collection. But nevertheless, when Czechoslovakia rediscovered itself in 1989, who was the first president? Another literary man who was there because of the books he had written. And my hero is his whole story is one of a young person lost in books, in particular one book which sent him in the direction that he went, namely Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. And so I try to describe what it is like in that particular situation to be led by books into one's relationships, when perhaps being led by something else might have been a little bit more of a success. But nevertheless, the idea prevailed then that somehow the written word contained the path to salvation. And that explained the spiritual hunger with which young people approached each other. And Jan, looking back from his job as a second-rate professor in a second-rate liberal arts college in this first-rate city, remembers this and thinks of it with longing, thinks with longing of what it was then to approach the other with this spiritual hunger as though you were to be redeemed by her. And he remembers a true moment of giving when he gave himself and she gave herself, which was the real freedom that that both of them had been wanting, which they thought then was within their grasp, but it immediately eluded them, and it's never to be recuperated now that he's enjoying the easygoing freedoms of the Western world, which are the kind of necessary but insufficient freedoms offered by a consumer society. He is not persuaded by the propaganda of the American Radio Free Europe and so on, that it's all about human rights. He knows there's something else, something deeper. It's really about longing, Sehnsucht, or Toha, as the Czechs call it, which is woven into the scheme of things and never to be satisfied merely by human rights and the elementary freedoms, however wonderful those are. So I think, just to conclude, that it's worth revisiting those times, especially if you can do so at the low cost of, how much is the book? $25? Something like that. And I'll sign it. But I think it's useful to look back over what we have lost as well as what we've gained. Of course, we've gained enormously, and I worked for the liberation of those parts of the world, and I can't possibly regard my whole life as a complete failure just because it was achieved. But on the other hand, I do remember that longing and that sense of the infinite value of the other and the unobtainability of the other, which saw people through those difficult times, and also is something that we should remember. Those were times when people recognized what was real to them, their nation, their religious tradition, their cultural values and loyalties. And of course, those things are easy to forget in a world of widely available luxuries and comforts. And I think we should also recognize the fragility of the new societies that have grown with the westernization and the opening of borders and so on. For selfishness and frivolity have a head start in a market economy over loyalty and sacrifice, as we know, and it produces a new society which is not so eager to defend itself and whose elites are not so committed to the people who look up to them as they perhaps ought to be. And I think this is one of the lessons we should take from the Ukraine, that the elite and the ordinary people are no longer properly attached, that there isn't a shared loyalty or a way in which that elite can clearly represent the people who look to it for its rescue. Moreover, thanks to the European Union, the elites of all those countries are rapidly leaving them. There's no reason why you should stay in Prague when you could live in London. And indeed, Putin, okay, there is. But let's let's take not Prague necessarily, but any little industrial town, Ostrava, for instance. Anyway, the elites are not as attached as they were. And interesting enough, the Russian elites are not as attached as they were. They all live in London or Geneva. Who would live in Russia, if they could choose? And this is a great problem in the Ukrainian situation. The people who should be leading that country in its hour of need are not there. So there are problems that have grown recently, and I think looking back at that time when people, for all sorts of good reasons and all sorts of bad reasons, felt deeply attached to each other, we have a glimpse of what those countries might be if they were to actually fight for themselves yet again. Thank you.
Roger, thank you indeed. Ambassador Gandalovic, please.
Well, thank you for the Hudson Institute for doing this. Thank you, Roger, for writing this book. I cannot even overstate how humbled I am to be sitting between these two men I really respect so much. Who am I to talk about your work? But yet I am the ambassador of the country you're writing about, so that makes me at least somehow credited. Maybe perhaps, again, first, you writing a book about our past and dealing with basically one sector of the society, which is the dissident sector, the group of people who have actually crossed that line, is extremely important. And I do hope that the book will be soon translated to Czech, because it will give us some sort of mirror view. As a matter of fact, not too many books have been written about the past. We still somehow grapple with our own past. And if there are books or movies shot on those years, many of them resort to humor, sarcasm, irony. Some of them even border with some sort of nostalgia. And there are very, very few books that would actually be fiction on the background of such a terrible situation as living as a dissident in a totalitarian country. You can understand that they were basically three groups of people. The members of the Communist Party, the privileged group, and they were about 10% of the entire population. In the nation of 15 million, as we speak of Czechoslovakia in those years, there were 1.5 million members of the Communist Party. Then, of course, there was a handful of dissidents in this comparison. They were, I think, less than 300 signatories to Charter 77, and then there were other dissidents associated with them. And these were people who really had crossed that line between living in some sort of decent conditions. And of course, I didn't say that in between there was this gray zone of majority of the nation. And that was this majority of nation that was actually hostage of that 1.5 million of the privileged members of the Communist Party. And those only people who were not hostage were those dissidents, because they actually had crossed that line so that they didn't need to bow. All they faced was more and more oppression and punishment, maybe perhaps jail time, but nothing could have been taken away from them. And that was something that we could possibly, in that bitter sense of the word, envy to them, because all other of us were hostage. And each day we had a difficult time facing ourselves in the mirror, because every single day we were doing compromises we didn't like. We used to do compromises or make compromises because of our children, who we wanted to be admitted to higher education, because of our own careers we wanted to pursue, because of everything. You know, some of the people wanted to get an apartment from the state, so they needed to make a compromise. And they didn't need to become the members of the Communist Party. They needed to just, shut up and not to protest, while the dissidents were those who were the sort of conscience of the nation. We knew about them because obviously we would be listening to free radio. And again, life must have been terrible because, particularly for young people who were, by all means, totally cut from any official education. It wasn't easy to educate a young man or woman in such an environment, because that doesn't necessarily mean that such a person is able to gather education at underground seminars. Only few were able to pick up their education. Many of them just ended up uneducated, which is obviously a handicap they've been carrying for the rest of their lives. So again, thank you for describing life in such conditions. Thank you for being able to actually identify different areas of the descent. There were at least three, as I might simplify that situation. You talked about the religious descent. There were obviously also people who were ousted of the Communist Party because of them participating in the attempt to, to reform the Communist Party. So that was a historic paradox, that those very persons who participated in the communist activities in the 50s then tried to reform the Communist Party and lost in '68, and then of course they became the dissidents alongside with liberal dissidents like Václav Havel, who never actually was the member of the Communist Party. So that was a third group of the dissent group, those who were dissidents because of their non-religious liberal conviction. And then maybe the fourth group, which were underground artists, rock musicians, theater actors or directors. Maybe perhaps I wish to correct you that Beatles wasn't the Beatles might have been widely popular among the what would say gray zone. Everybody loved Beatles, and we were able to listen to Beatles then. But the dissident rock groups were actually inspired by the Velvet Underground. So the Plastic People of the Universe sort of drew their inspiration from that source, and that created this bond between Václav Havel eventually and Lou Reed. So with that cultural explanation, thank you again for including me. It's such an honor. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. John O'Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Chris, and it's a very great pleasure to be here. Let me say, first of all, that this is a terrific book, so you should buy it. And secondly, I'm going to try and avoid telling you everything that happens, because one should not really know the plot of a novel when one starts to read it. But unavoidably, I may reveal one or two things, although I think my interpretation of what Roger has written may differ from what Roger himself thinks was happening. But the first thing I want to talk about is the city he's describing. I mean, this was having lived in Prague for 4 years, of course, at a later stage. I found this very fascinating indeed, because Prague in this novel is a kind of a purgatory. He mentions that his character is riding on the underground all the time, developing fantasies about the people in the carriage with him, but never speaking to them. And indeed, I mean, the whole project, one of the elements of the communist project, was to prevent people speaking to one another pleasantly, casually, socially, insofar as they could. It was to divide people so that they wouldn't realize what they shared in common. The regime propaganda was they they were sharing everything in common, but the regime didn't want them to feel that they were sharing things in common, because then they might become a threat to the regime. Now, I first went to Prague earlier than the novel is set, in 1971, and Prague in those days this was 3 years after '68, and Prague was, I think, in a worse state then than at the stage that this novel is about, because in addition to the recent memory of what high Stalinism had been like, which is, I think, well described in Anne Applebaum's recent book, the suppression of the Prague Spring had created a feeling, I think, of self-hatred and self-contempt among many Czechs. They felt they should have fought. They hadn't fought in '38, and they didn't fight now. Well, on this trip, by the way, I was taking American students around Europe, and I came from Budapest to Prague, and then went from there to East Berlin. Budapest was relatively free and cheerful. It was known as the jolliest barracks in the socialist camp. And I had a very pleasant time there. And although I was a strong anti-communist, I felt that there was some element of human freedom there. When you got off the train in Prague, I couldn't get a sandwich at 10 o'clock at night. There was a deadening quality about the whole society. I had the experiences that very often people had in those days, which were odd in their way. For example, paying for a meal in dollars and then getting more money back in change at the official exchange rate, because of course I'd given them an awful lot of money at the unofficial rate. And but when one could speak to people, and people were very reluctant to speak to you, you did feel this sense of, as I say, self-contempt. And the regime had demonstrated only too recently, both in '68 and previously, that real force stood behind the normalization project. Václav Havel and other people have spoken about submission to the lie as being the principal element of totalitarianism in those years. And there's no doubt that that was important. But it was achieved as a result of previous brutality. I think the Hungarian-Canadian Jewish writer George Jonas tells a story that a professor disappeared on one occasion. He was unpopular with the regime, but he just disappeared. Later, a student in his class was charged with his murder. This is, I think, in Hungary. Charged with his murder. He was convicted and executed. Later on in the year, the professor turned up again. Nobody said anything. The message was, we can do anything we like to you. Now, that stage had passed, but the memory of it was there. And the result, and the everyday oppression of a pedestrian, deadening denial of the normal activities life was very real. There's a lot of it in Roger's book, but I'm going to take an example from elsewhere. Roger himself played, I think, a heroic role in the years of normalization. He's understated it here, but he went to Czechoslovakia. He gave private philosophy lectures. He helped organize the books going there and so on. And he took risks of being beaten up, arrested, interrogated, and so on. If you want to know what that kind of thing was like, it's worth, and how life was made oppressive at an everyday level for people. Think of the fact that, think of, for example, a scene from Stoppard's play, Professional Foul. An English philosophy lecturer accepts an official Czech invitation to give a lecture, philosophy lecture, in Prague, almost entirely because there's an England versus Czechoslovakia football match on, and he's got tickets for it so he can get a free trip. When he's in his hotel, the doorbell rings, he opens the door, and one of his former students, a chap who got a first, is there. And he's very pleased to see him, and he says, "How nice to see you. I remember you, of course. You did very well, I think, at first. What are you doing now?" And the man says, "Oh, well, I'm a cleaner." And the philosophy professor says, "A cleaner? A cleaner? you know, I'm afraid I just don't keep up with the philosophy journals these days. I don't know that school. And he says, no, I'm a cleaner. I mean, I clean lavatories. That's what I do for a living. And Roger and I know, and I'm sure Peter knew people who, I mean, I knew Pavel Bratinka, and he was later a minister, but he was a stoker. He was given a job as a stoker and spent his time keeping buildings warm. Now, that was the kind of thing that happened to people who rebelled. And then there were the careerists. And I think someone later calculated that for every member of the Communist Party who was a genuine communist or supporter of the regime, there were 7 careerists. They did all right later, and they've done very well. But the feeling about life then, which is what this book has, is very powerful in conveying the way in which people had to retreat either into their own personalities in order to survive, or into small dissident groups. Now, there are 2 main characters in the book. There are others, and they are, of course, Betka, who is the woman who, as Roger said, in a sense, tempts Jan out of the self-obsessed life he's leading, and who becomes with whom he falls in love. I think she is an absolutely marvelous character. This happens to me. I fell in love a bit with her. She's the classic girl with whom you have hoped to spend a life, but somehow she's got away. She's elusive, a will-o'-the-wisp, beautiful, intelligent, charming, and yet at the same time, how interested is she in you? And is she not also interested in him and him? And what are their relationships and so on? So that's the kind of suspiciousness in which he starts. I'm less entranced with Jan. That's probably as it should be. But at the same time, my feeling about him is that he is very reasonably alienated from the society in which he lives. But he would be alienated, I think, perhaps in any society, because, as Roger points out, he's shaped, among other things, by the kind of Dostoevskian and Sartrean literature of alienation. Now, he may differ. This may be an interpretation he doesn't have of his own character. But I felt that, in a way, this man would never be happy. And he is therefore, he's moving from purgatory, but he's almost certainly going to end up in purgatory as well. And then, of course, the relationship is one that there is this moment in which the 2 lovers become, in a sense, aware of each other's uniqueness, but their own absolute compatibility, which passes. But where does this happen? Why? It happens in the Sudetenland, in the area in an area of Czechoslovakia from which the earlier inhabitants have been expelled at the end of the war, and which are now occupied, in the case of Betka and her family, I think she's basically descended from I've forgotten that. Russian. She said Russian, right? She's
descended from a collaborator.
Collaborator. Now, is this home in which she has a reverence for the household and the household gods and the faith and the past, and she wants to be part of it, and she has made herself part of it in a way, though we discover that's more complicated later. She's a kind of a cuckoo in the nest, but nonetheless a patriotic cuckoo in the nest. She wanted to be. She's got a reverence for the past, which I don't think Jan or Honza really can quite develop in himself effectively, and that separates them. So the reverence for the past, which is an element in a good life, which is denied to people here. That's at least my interpretation. Now, the second thing is religion. Religion, it seems to me, suffused the Polish Revolution more than it did the Czech or Hungarian revolutions or any of the others, much more powerfully and much more naturally. I wouldn't myself exaggerate the degree, as I think some have done, to which rock and roll was a major factor. It was a factor. But there's a story about that which I think it's worth remembering. Norman von Horitz visited Havel, and when he went to visit Havel in his flat, he discovered there was a large portrait of John Lennon. And he didn't have the highest opinion of Lennon, and so he raised a question. And Havel said, well, he's supporting our revolution. And Norman then replied, well, yes, he'll support you now you're oppressed, but he wouldn't support you if you were still successfully resisting oppression. And I think that is an element, there's an element of truth about that in the Western left and its relationship with the people living under communism. They were sympathetic to them once they were oppressed, but they weren't going to help them to avoid to resist oppression effectively. And the Catholic Church in Poland was a much more profound form of resistance, both for the obvious reason, but also because the Catholic Church, particularly in the diocese where the man who was later Pope was Archbishop, gave cultural shelter to all forms of dissidence. You didn't have to be a Catholic to find the Catholic institutions and church protecting your freedom, liberty, and ability to discuss. And to that extent, I think, and that explains to me at least, partly why the Polish national experiment since then has been happier. Not national experiment, I'm sorry. Why the Polish national experience since then has been happier. Now, I've gone on too long. I'll just try to sum up. At the end of the novel, we find Jan in the United States, as Roger has described. He's exchanged a world, as it seems to him, and I think he's querulous and cantankerous and difficult beyond what is necessary as a result of his experience. He's exchanged a world of silence and the underground for one of triviality. And my feeling about that is there's obviously a lot of truth in that. There's obviously triviality is one of the possibilities in a free world. We are free to be trivial, and we've taken full advantage of that freedom in recent years. But maybe, first of all, that will always be a temptation of freedom, and for some people, it's going to be, and I think for most people, to be honest, it's going to be a stage of liberty from which they will grow out. I mean, in life terms, you have a trivial period, you go to school, you have a trivial period, you get married and become serious. And I think that's true for societies to a degree as well. At least I hope it's true. But certainly at the end of the novel, others have succeeded. Betka has succeeded. And I think that is because she is more rooted. She's more rooted. I should have said, by the way, that Jan's mother is a very significant figure in the novel, in my view, and she is a religious figure. Jan discovers how deeply religious she is as the novel goes on, and she's played a very considerable role, more than he realizes it. And I'll finally end on this parochial defense note. I have to point out to Roger, despite what he said about Radio Free or Radio Liberty, that it does get Jan's mother out of prison. And the role that Radio Free Europe played in those years is not just a question of it defending human rights. It certainly did that. It also made available to cultures which were starved of their traditional culture, but to a considerable extent, it made their national culture available to them, which what the Russian service of Radio Liberty does today to a great extent. But having said that, if you talk to the people who lived in those years in places as far apart as Poland and Romania, you will find that listening to Radio Liberty was a key element of keeping their sanity and their hope for the future. And that hope turned out to be justified, even though, even a year before 1989, it still seemed like the illusion that Jan thought it was.
John, thank you very much.
Well, I thank you both for those very perceptive comments, and I don't really have anything to say except that I think what all novelists say, which is don't confuse me with my characters. And I fully sympathise with John's reservations about Jan, but I think if he had been the kind of cheerful person that fully accepted all the changes and didn't look back with an element of grief on the longing that he'd once experienced, then he wouldn't have been the kind of character who could convey just what that longing was, you know. And an ordinary, simple, forward-going person such as, well, I don't want to say you're that, John, but, you know, such as you would have loved to have seen, would have missed the point of those moments. But anyway, I think that's probably enough from me.
Roger, a striking moment in the novel that's not been described exactly, but if you've read the novel and have listened to the commentary, you remember it, there is a professor, and I don't claim that it's Professor Roger Scruton, but there is a visiting professor from the West. And it is striking that he sees the Czech dissidents very much through Western eyes, and he wants to tell them that their problem is a problem of human rights, and he has these abstract academic and left liberal conception of what the struggle is all about, which is completely incomprehensible to them. They have no idea what he is talking about. Is that based on actual experience? Or Peter, for you when you were there, we can all acknowledge that Radio Free Europe did wondrous good things in keeping hope alive and telling people that there actually was some truth in the world out there and some hope. But were people who were organizing human rights campaigns in the West mischievous a bunch, or did they have were they ineffectual, or were they resented within Prague or other spots in the East?
Is this to me or to Peter? Well, I would say that they were, of course, useful. I wouldn't want to say they were useful idiots either. You know, I mean, they, in Lenin's sense, they were people who had a slightly one-dimensional view of what the situation was, but in their own terms worked relentlessly to improve it. And of course, that was understood by people like Václav Havel, who tried to engage with the human rights movements in the West. But one of the most important things, in my view, and Peter might have something to add to this, one of the most important things about Charter 77, which was a declaration that there were not just rights, but actually laws that had been passed through the signing of the Helsinki Accords, wasn't it? That in fact the real emphasis on it was not some abstract idea of human rights independent of the law. They were saying that, look, in 1968, the Helsinki Accords were ratified here, so that they are part of the law. And what we're doing is really attempting to make the state live by its own law. And that idea of the rule of law is terribly important in Havel's thinking and the thinking of quite a lot of people around him. And in particular, when he's established VONS, which is means the well, essentially the
Committee for Defense of Unjustly Persecuted.
Yes, but it means unjustly prosecuted as well, doesn't it? People who he was actually advocating a proper legal procedures, due process under the law. So it was very much more highly educated than an ordinary human rights machine, and it enabled us, people like me, to say, look, to many Czechs at the time, look, this is what we have not only lived through but produced the theory of, we English conservatives over the last 2 centuries. So you're really with us, not with the normal left liberal way of seeing things. Havel never accepted that, but a lot of people did. Pavel Bratinka, whom John mentioned, and Václav Bender and people like that did accept that. So that was very interesting, and I think many people in Poland saw this too, you know, and it was, I think, something that, when I described that character, that visiting American professor who addresses the seminar, I had in mind the many left liberals who did visit, who found themselves suitably inoculated against any truth that interfered with their prejudices.
Let me just add to that. That's a very interesting scene, Roger, because in addition to the point you've just made, the irony is that he then does, without necessarily intending to do so in quite the way he does, he then stimulates a real debate among the...
That's what's so important about, because of his dogmatic attachment to the left liberal view of things, he opens their eyes to the fact that there is a completely different debate going on in the West than the one that they knew.
Well, I think that obviously there are many jokes about people who eventually defected intellectuals and ended up at American universities and got shocked because those professors who invited them to teach at those universities had bust of Lenin in their offices. But that's a joke. But it's really little too trivial. But we can very much agree that it was the idea of human rights that united the dissidents throughout the entire spectrum, as I said, from those who were actually dissidents out of necessity because they lost that struggle within the Communist Party in the '68, and they were just defeated by those conservatives in the Communist Party with the help of the Russian tanks. Then you had people like Václav Havel who really did believe in human rights. Then you had the religious segment of the dissident movement, and of course the young people who wanted just play rock and roll and not being controlled by the state. And all these people united on the idea of human rights. Obviously at the very moment when the Velvet Revolution started or happened, they just disagreed on just about anything, because how could you have Bratinka, who is conservative, with those former communists who even still in the early '60s were active members of the Communist Party in one group. It only could happen within the under the lid of the totalitarian regime. Once the lid was removed, they inevitably spread in different directions. So this is when the political spectrum, the political parties were started in early '90s in our country.
Yes.
I have 2 points, if I may.
Sure.
First, again, this phenomenon of the relationship, it's very important because you have to appreciate that, as I said, the dissident life was really difficult and very much isolated from even the gray zone. So it wasn't easy for a young man to find a a girl, because these families simply didn't meet. These worlds were totally apart, and as these young men and women didn't attend normal schools, they didn't even have regular opportunities to meet their counterparts. So it was, even from this point of view, tough life for them. Second, Sudetenland. It's a very important phenomenon in your book, because it addresses another historic trauma of our country, when obviously the Germans were pushed out, and new inhabitants of those regions, and these are significant parts of our country. So when you read about the liquidation of this small town because of mining, it's real history in our country. As a matter of fact, in the region I represent, I come from this part of the country. And thirdly, religion. I think that you're right that in Czech lands, in Bohemia, religion didn't play such a significant role as it did play in Poland, but you have to remember that we used to be Czechoslovakia, and in Slovakia, religion played a similar role, and there these segments, I would say the liberal segments of the dissident movement were much smaller, while the religious segment was much more important.
And if I can, well, let me accept that entirely, but make the additional point that just as in Krakow, when John Paul was the bishop there, just as the Catholic Church provided a kind of canopy for dissent and debate and meeting of every kind between all groups, so his visit to Poland created across the whole of Eastern and Central Europe the same kind of excitement and the same encouragement of contact between different people. When you were watching the Pope on television, or if you were at one of his sermons, you will suddenly realize the people alongside you were by their presence there, by their interest and their reactions, they were rejecting the fictions of the regime, and you could therefore make a kind of contact with them that was not normally possible, because the trust that is normally necessary for that kind of contact didn't exist. The Pope, in effect, helped to create that trust among people who'd never met each other before.
Thank you very much. Let's move to general discussion, comments, questions. I will call on you. If you could wait until the microphone arrives and introduce yourself and make your comment. Yes, sir.
Roger, I would like to ask you...
You could introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Samar Chatterjee, SAFE Foundation. I would like to find out, obviously from your accent it appears you're a British citizen, so given that you know the history of British colonialism too, and the kind of barbarism that was perpetrated in various countries, including the one I was born in India, almost 100 years plus. And the communist oppression in these countries probably looks like a child's play compared to what the British did in India and other places, that the colonialism. So has it ever bothered you when you were writing, and I'm sure you're familiar with the history of England and the colonial past, which was pretty brutal and barbaric, in our opinion. Has it ever bothered you that you're writing about something, but your own people, may not be all the British people, some of them, particularly those who controlled British Empire, were involved in such similar barbarism?
Well, actually, that didn't bother me. Because I was writing about a specific situation which I knew, and whatever you think about the British Empire in India, and you've made it very clear what you think about it. It happened an awful long time before now, and indeed, by the time I was conscious, the British Empire no longer existed in India, so I couldn't have had the experience. So, you know, from the point of view of writing a novel, wouldn't have helped me to have been bothered, I suspect. It may be, though, that I should be bothered, and as a rational being with an open mind, I will try and make myself bothered in honour to your remark.
It would have given you a little balance.
Well, you know.
And those crooks are doing it too.
Yeah.
Let me encourage you not to be bothered.
No, I don't think we need an argument about this, though, John.
No, I would say simply, though, that I'm not going to go into the impact, but the argument you that was just advanced is an argument about ever being concerned about anything, because you can always say, well, you're not talking about this other question. You know, how can you possibly discuss the poor housing situation when there is murder going on in Chicago or something like that? I mean, it's a kind of form of argument I find very irritating.
Yes, sir. This gentleman here, and then we'll move up to the front.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scruton and all the speakers. My name is Enrique Payares, and I'm doing a PhD at Catholic University. It seems to me that the debate is about something, or that some of the points that you bring up are something far more profound than what's merely in the political surface. And it seems to me that you hit upon a point that is very important, and that is very that is strictly relevant to the 20th century and to the 21st century, which is this new phenomenon, this new particular kind of alienation that is experienced in totalitarian regimes, maybe for the first time, and that and a kind of a different, but at the same time similar alienation that we might experience in a consumer society. Now, with that in mind, what do we do, and how do we relate to others? How do we kind of recover our associations? How do we give our being a little bit more weight in the modern world to be able to live not in a state of alienation, but to be at home in the world?
Well, that's a very good question, and that is entirely the direction in which my own thinking and feeling while writing the book was going. I was writing it in full consciousness that it's very easy to caricature things, to look back and say, look, here are the good people, here are the bad people, here is this evil totalitarian regime, and here is the liberation that we're hoping for, and that's it, and just tell the story of the liberation. And of course, as John says, that liberation was a wonderful thing, and it's good that totalitarian regimes should disappear. But you rightly say that I was trying to deal with something more profound, which is that in the human soul which has, as it were, conjured the totalitarian system from wherever it hides, as it were, and made it into a reality, and how the human soul lives in that reality, and how does it look for its fulfillment, and whether perhaps there are ways of looking for your fulfillment in that difficult situation which are lost when you find yourself in an easier situation. And the alienation point is very important, because if you look back at, say, the literature of France, France went through a terrible time, obviously, the occupation, the Nazi occupation, but even before the Nazi occupation, the literature of France was absolutely riddled with the communist idea and the sympathy for the Russian Revolution and so on. There was a kind of creeping totalitarianism in the thought of the French intellectuals in the 30s, people like André Breton and so on. and this was amplified by the war, so that France, when liberated in 1945, seemed to be craving some kind of totalitarian government. And the writers like Sartre were, as it were, trying to conjure that thing. And the whole effect of La Nausée is to describe an individual who cannot relate, but needs to be controlled. And I suspect that, therefore, that maybe that Europe went through, especially occupied Europe, not my country, but occupied Europe, went through a spiritual crisis as a result of the two world wars, and looked for it in the wrong place, looked for it in the individual self, you know, the en soi, pour soi, rather, of Sartre. Really, things only changed when Jean-Paul II came along and said, look for it not in yourself, but outside yourself, and in what you can give yourself to.
Here, and then this lady right here, and then this gentleman to the right.
I'm his sister, and I wanted to ask actually.
That explains him completely.
I wanted to actually ask a question along the same lines. I'm Macarena Pallares, by the way. I work with the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. I wanted to ask a very similar question, but I'll take it from a different perspective. In the novel, I was struck by the way in which language relates to our access to truth and human beings' search for meaning. And that sounds like a very abstract thing, but you describe it very tangibly and very vividly, because in fact, you have a character who studies the way in which the communist regime twists language and only allows certain words. And then I was struck by the way in which the underground church plays a part in using some of those same words, like community or love or sacrifice, but retaining a much deeper meaning. And perhaps that's why the church was such an important aspect of dissenting to the communist regime. But now, at the end of the novel, we do end in America, and the communist kitsch, there was a way of escaping it, in a way, perhaps through religion, high culture. But we have our own forms of kitsch in Washington, D.C. And how do we escape that?
Yeah, I wish I could answer that question. Again, I have to say that you mustn't confuse me with my characters, but the character who recognizes that the as it were the assault on his spiritual possibilities, of which he is the victim, comes about through language, through the confiscation of natural ways of speaking, turning everything into a sort of kind of code, and the meaning of that code is power. That character also recognizes that kitsch is part of this. Kitsch is a way of falsifying the world of art and also the world of religion too. You can replace all these real things with their fake substitutes, and that's in a similar way. Language is not kitschified, but made into a newspeak, which permits only the ideas that the regime would allow. And I think it's one of the most prophetic things that in George Orwell in 1984, this thought, because we saw it completely in communist Europe, and especially in Czechoslovakia, because the language is prone to this. Anyway, it's a slightly artificial language. Peter probably might not agree with me about this, but there were sort of kind of mechanical devices that everything was the whole world was described in terms of progress, versus reaction, going forward versus going backwards. There's what François Tom calls a pan-dynamism of the communist worldview, which is built into the language. And it's not as though American politics is free from that either, or the American language in day-to-day use. I suspect, you see, this is one of the things that drew people to religion, for the reason that you said, that because of the liturgical inheritance and the Bible, you find utterances which are compelled from people by their truth, by their truth to life. And those words are tested over centuries and still they're saturated with a meaning that can't be removed from them. And it's one of the interesting things that certainly the young people that I knew would always refresh themselves with the Psalms. The translation into Czech, obviously, of the Psalms, which it restores language to its fundamental meaning in the human soul. And that was not just believers, but the ordinary agnostic, cynical Czech would still do this.
Yes, sir. This gentleman, yes.
Milton Grunfeld, I'm an architect. It strikes me that the character of this book, it's not surprising he'd be disappointed with life, both behind the Iron Curtain and in the West, because they both actually follow the same gods, which are nationalism, progress, and human rights. And what of course is missing is a whole different model that predates the 19th century, which those ideas are all 19th century. But the more eternal things, which I think is what is being talked about here, are pre-19th century. And I think in some ways, but now you have to think about the political implications of that. Okay, we understand existentially we need something more than these three things: progress, human rights, and the nation, patriotism. And it seems like the Austro-Hungarian Empire had a lot to recommend it. The empire is pre-19th century, where people did live in their own way, in their own place, but were protected by an overarching republic, or an empire, if you will. Might be a model that would hold more promise, rather than making a god out of your nation.
Well, that raises so many questions, even more than the questions raised by the Indian gentleman earlier. But now that he's gone, I can confess that I'm in favor of empires. and in particular of ours. But ours is lost, unfortunately.
Well, I think that you might want to raise more questions, but one point on your this lady on your comment on this language. Václav Havel even called it ptidepe in one of these plays. Totally artificial, meaningless language that people simply put through the one ear and out the other. The point was that, of course, nobody believed that. But the point was that who should we have believed in? I mean, those were people who believed in the Bible and the Psalms and all these things, but not too many. And the others were simply left to their own intuition. Maybe, perhaps, for most of us, it was like just reversing the values. So if they say A, we would think B. But even that wasn't enough, and it wasn't preparing us for the complexity of the world. And this is what may give you an explanation why these nations that freed themselves 25 years ago are still struggling morally. How do they, transform themselves to normal society? Because again, for the most people, there wasn't any opportunity for any open discussion about things. The only thing you could do was to reverse what did they say. But again, it wasn't enough. And those dissidents, they had at least underground seminars, open discussions. They had some sort of debate. So they came much better prepared, and this is not a coincidence that many of those dissidents really actually were prepared for political functions, for being leaders of the state, including Václav Havel, of course, in the first place, but people like Bratinka, Kroupa, and others who were so prepared, and we could ever only envy them the depth of their knowledge, while we simply went through our lives blocking the official propaganda, but not having the opportunity to discussing the difficult stuff, so resorting to easy talk, easy life, resorting to privacy, to our cottages, our chalupas, maybe sitting in the pubs drinking beers, and talking what's the equivalent of bullshit. Sorry.
Could I just come in? Surely the problem with your argument is simply that one shouldn't make a god out of anything. It isn't that these are bad things. It is that by making them the only thing, then we make a mistake, yes. So, I mean, communism, the problem with communism was it made a god out of community. But of course, when you do that, what you produce is intense competitive individualism and rivalry. And that was true of practically everything in the communist experiment. All of their aims turned into the opposite in practice. Altruism turned, as I say, into competitive greed and individualism. I mean, people would sell themselves for a pair of silk stockings or a nice sweater.
Yes, sir.
My name is Mark Venezia, and I'm a law student. So I haven't read the book yet, and so what I have to do is extrapolate from things that you said and from John O'Sullivan's version of it. And the character Jan, who... So even if I'm misinterpreting it, I'm going to ask you a sociology question. So I think of Jan as immersed in triviality and having some nostalgia for meaningful relationships, conflicts, and so on of the past. Everything was meaningful then, and now things are trivial. Is there, just broadly, or maybe you have to go all the way east to Russia, a nostalgia for that past of taking art more seriously, taking relationships more seriously, taking big intellectual debates of fundamental issues more seriously, and consequently, there is actually an appeal to it by, for example, Putin. So it's a question about what are people actually thinking now in the East.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. There is, of course, a word in German, Ostalgie, for this nostalgie, for the this attitude of nostalgia towards the old East Germany, the Ost, and many people feel it because life for many people was simpler then, and of course, people find it very difficult to deal with all the many decisions that have to be made in a free market and so on. And there's no doubt that Putin does depend to a great extent on that, certainly among older people. It's younger people who would tend to form the opposition to Putin.
But with all due respect, I think you missed the question because he asked about those who could be nostalgic about those big debates, big ideas. And again, I have to repeat that Jan is actually a member of the dissident group, where, with the help of those who came from the outside, at underground seminars. Within this limited group, there was a debate, there was an intellectual contest among different views, outside of that group, there was nothing. So those people who might be nostalgic, like you said, they might be nostalgic for not intellectual, challenging environment. They were just not nostalgic, or they are still nostalgic for those secure conditions they used to have under the socialist regime. So this is a different kind of nostalgia.
I'm actually talking about this kind of nostalgia. Life was more meaningful then.
Yeah.
Not life was simpler because there was
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well.
So again, this was a very small group that had such an opportunity. I mean, I wouldn't even call it privilege or opportunity, because these were people who, that was all that had left to them, this freedom to talk in some basement somewhere.
You know, I think also in the West, Cold War served for some people as a kind of very modest version of big ideas. In other words, I think when one went to Central and Eastern Europe during the Cold War, you did sense, you felt as though you were going into a dangerous place. I don't mean that you were going to be mugged or anything, but there was a sense you were going from one world into another, and that there was a struggle in the world between good and evil. One can exaggerate that, of course, make it oversimple, but I think it was true, and one recognized the people in these other countries as being one's allies in that struggle. And we were their very inadequate allies on the other side. So I think that there was perhaps an exaggerated sense among some Westerners that they were fighting a moral struggle when they were fighting the Cold War. But it was there. And some people definitely, I think, feel a nostalgia for that.
Yes, sir.
John Soliday, independent economist. Mr. Scruton, I'm wondering what set of beliefs do you think would be necessary to make Jan committed to, that's the worst, become a limited government type, just out of my own bias, or, you know, belief in individual freedom and private property, that kind of stuff. And also John O'Sullivan, and Ambassador. What do we need?
Well, we need just what you've said, belief in those things. It's very...
But do we need the Psalms? Or what do we need to get to those things? That's my question.
Yes. How do you get to them from scratch is really the problem, isn't it? If we get to them because they're the end point of a long process of development, from monarchical government through the Enlightenment, the American Constitution and the British common law, English common law rather, to the point where today we can see that that without private property, the rule of law, equity, and so on, human life is only half of what it can be, and we know that because we've gone through all the arguments. I did have the experience in that part of the world, especially in Poland, actually, in trying to explain to people in 10 easy lessons just what these concepts are and why they were important and why they were more important than social welfare and all the other things that they were brought up on. You'll be pleased to know that I made no progress whatsoever.
This gentleman here has been waiting, and then 2 questions from the back.
Hello, I'm Michael Wagner. I'm a psychologist. And I guess my question is probably going to be similar, I feel like, to a lot of the other questions. I feel like this theme of, I was hoping that John would be right, that this sort of obsession with the trivial in the U.S. is perhaps an adolescent phase. But I guess my fear would be that it's in fact perhaps a type of despair. I guess we see that Pascal talks about the tranquilizing with the trivial as a kind of giving into despair, and Soren Kierkegaard will categorize it similarly as a type of despair, along with the despair of Sartre, right, which is different, kind of a despair because one cannot find the meaning within yourself, as one cannot find meaning in the trivial. And I guess again, the question of this movement, of how we move from this position of unable to live life, life that doesn't have weight, doesn't have meaning. It strikes me that it doesn't inevitably resolve culturally. I think I was thinking, in my work as a psychologist, it's clear that some people who become tranquilized by the trivial become stuck in the trivial and stuck in a life without meaning. And so I guess I was wondering, again, if there's, in that context, what would be sort of the next developmental step for a cultural tranquilized by the trivial to move beyond?
Well, it's another deep question, to which I don't have an answer. I think, though, you're sort of talking psychologically. People's deepest feelings are associated with their way of attaching themselves, either to other people or to their place, or the culture, or the religion that they've inherited, and those attachments are what really matter. And when you become trivial, it's because you're trying to shake them off. And an untrivial person will stay in that. A trivial person will stay in that condition, shaking off attachment, and not responding to the call of duty, etc. But a non-trivial person moves on to find the new attachment, the thing to which he can, in which he can, as it were, invest his psychological capital. This process has been described in many different ways by Bowlby and also by Hegel, of course, in his philosophy. And I think that it's a general truth that we all recognize once it's pointed out to us, that from triviality you must move on. But the rewards of staying trivial are, for the moment, so attractive that you don't. And then at a certain stage it's too late. You look in the mirror and you say, who is this facetious old man? You know?
Excuse me, can I just throw... I just want to throw the question back at you a little. There is at the moment in the United States a kind of explosion of altruism. If you look at the number of institutions that have been set up by wealthy people or people in retirement to help others, in every field you are seeing foundations and being set up, sometimes family ones, sometimes, I mean, the Gates one would be the massive one, but there are many, many small ones and modest ones. All of them doing, I think, probably good work, and I suspect practically everyone in the room thinks these are basically good things. Now, if we think they're good things, fine. But do we think that they will give meaning to the people who've done this? Is that enough to give meaning to those lives? I think certainly a lot of people, particularly non-believers, would say yes. A life spent in helping others and improving things in that way is probably a virtuous life. I mean, I think religious people would tend to say, well, these are good things, of course, but they're not quite enough, and they won't satisfy, and they won't solve the alienation problem, which we earlier agreed apparently was the foundation of all these problems. So I think, therefore, that the triviality, when you might solve triviality in a way, but do you solve the deeper problem of which it is merely one expression, or does an altruistic life then become a form of triviality? I don't believe it does, but I can imagine some people might argue it does. But what do you think?
Yes,
well,
yes,
I guess what I would think would be that one for which it was done for the sake purely of altruism, that is to give meaning to one's own life, and in fact becomes selfish and remains within the person itself, and therefore isn't going to give it a meaning which prevents it from being alienated. So, thanks.
Yes, in the back. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Maya. I'm also a psychologist. I'm a former Dr. Scruton student. And whatever I think or you think about British history, I know that there are still good British people, and because of Dr. Scruton's generosity, I was able to be here in the States and graduate with my degree in psychology. But my question is just a follow-up question again. I think we're really trying to understand that what was lost in a communist regime, and not talking about nostalgia in a sense that communists empowered people were kind of grieving after, but kind of talking about those more internal things, as well as things that I think Alexander Solzhenitsyn addressed in his address to Harvard and many other places. But to me, I'm just really trying still to understand what is it in the human nature that that makes suppressive regimes so much more conducive to putting things in perspective and understanding that life is, or the eternal life is not within us but outside of us, and seeking God and long-lasting relationships.
Well, I wish I could answer that question too. I mean, it is the case that the great spiritual testimonies that the modern world provides come largely from people in a state of oppression or deprivation of some kind. There's very little that's come out of German literature to match Bonhoeffer, and there is likewise in Russian literature. From Dostoevsky onwards, it's the person who's suffering the pressure from above who actually reveals the meaning of it, and I suspect we just have to accept that. This isn't an argument for saying we ought to oppress people so that they're more meaningful, but it is an argument for thinking that indeed what is greatest and what is best in human beings comes out in that way. And after all, it's about to be Good Friday, the story of which is that, that through suffering, the truth of our condition is not only revealed, but also redeemed. And I say that, I think you don't have to be a Christian to believe that. That is just a truth that's obvious. Oh.
I'm Al Regnery. I'm a publisher. Roger, I came in late, and so I always am afraid to ask a question for fear that it might have been answered before I got here, but let me try anyway. Your book takes place towards the end of the communist time in Czechoslovakia, and you've spent a good deal of your life being a thorn in the side of the British and the American left, liberalism, and I think when Whittaker Chambers in Witness, he said that when he aimed his sling at communism, I think he said he hit something much more sinister than that was American liberalism. And I just wondered if you could talk for a minute about the extent to which you thought as a novelist of talking about liberalism and socialism as opposed to communism, which was so obvious in the book.
Well, yes, it's difficult to say now what Whittaker Chambers said, even though it's true, because although communism has collapsed, the left liberal worldview has triumphed. That's say the view which sees human communities as directed towards the equalization of their members, the constant provision from a central source of their needs, and the administering of social justice by an all-powerful elite of bureaucrats controlled from Harvard University. This vision is accepted as the truth, at least in the universities, because it's the thing, of course, which gives them power. It doesn't follow that you shouldn't be saying that it's not the truth about the human condition. But, to be a thorn in the flesh of the communist regimes had a very different feel from being a thorn in the flesh to the left liberal establishment in the universities, for me, the communist regimes couldn't deprive you of a job, for a start, and the left liberal regimes that we have lived under have a kind of soft approach to things, which makes you look much more easily look ridiculous. You know, what are you complaining about? Is the general response to somebody like me.
What I believe will be our last question in the back.
Hi, my name is Suli. I'm also a psychologist, also a former student of Dr. Scruton. So I guess my question, in your experience, Dr. Scruton, is I haven't read the book, so please forgive this question if you explain it in your book, but you write about the people who are oppressed by communism, right? What about the people who are the perpetrators? In your experience, I guess, these are still human beings, right? There's also a sense of, it appears that there is a sense of alienation for them as well, in terms of how they give their personhood to this greater cause, of whatever it is that they see is worth their life, worth their time. It's just like in Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory, he talks about this police officer who's the communist after this priest. So I wonder if, in your experience, you have encountered these people, and what is the parallel process of the alienation for them as opposed to the people who are oppressed?
Well, don't know quite what to say, except that I think Gorokowski talked about this at a certain stage. You know, that the Communist Party entered a stage very early on in the Soviet Union in which it was in the hands of people who didn't believe its message, and recognized that it was much easier to live by that message if you didn't believe it. It became a set of instructions for keeping order and for keeping people down, and you were as little persuaded by it as the people whom you were tormenting. And this again, George Orwell saw in 1984. You know, O'Brien, or whatever his name is, the person who's imposing this on Winston Smith, is completely of the same view as Winston Smith. This is absolutely absurd. And for the very reason that it's absolutely absurd, it's useful to us. And I think there was a lot of that in Eastern Europe, especially among more intelligent communists. They were much more persuasive exponents of communism than my colleagues in the University of London, who had the naivety to believe it, and therefore got stuck at after the first three premises. You know, where do we go from here?
John?
Well, I think the gentleman and I in the second row probably want the same kind of government, which is to say a small, modest, limited government. But I think we would also agree that in the event that that government were to arrive, we would not experience ecstasy. We would not throw our hats in that. We would not have the same kind of jubilation, say, that people felt collectively on the liberation of Paris, say. We would feel jolly good. Well, that's nice, and now we'll get on with life. And in a way, a lot of the discussion has been about the inappropriateness of pursuing transcendental aims by political means. When you try to do that, it just doesn't work. And not only doesn't it work, it often turns out to be a boomerang. It turns around and hurts you deeply. And that's true for the people living under the rulers, and for the rulers themselves. They experience it in a different way because even they get sick of it in the end and become ashamed, and it alienates their families and so on. So the sensible thing to do is to try to get a reasonable sort of government and then get on with life. And then you have to, in a sense, avoid triviality by the simple process of trying to lead a good life. Now, I think it's easier to lead a good life if you have a belief in God who is sort of watching you and ticking you off every now and then. And furthermore, that gives you it makes the whole experience, in a sense, more deep psychologically, and I would say in other ways. But having said that, if you don't believe in God, you just have to get on with having a better life and being more serious, and that will be perhaps not enough, but it will be better than the opposite.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming this evening, taking part in this discussion. We're now going to adjourn to the rear of the room, and I really do encourage everybody to buy this book. It is a wonderful book. It is going to endure. In addition to being a profound inquiry, as we have seen from this discussion, it's also a terrific thriller and a mystery that keeps you hanging and turning the pages, and it's a wonderful experience to read. So Roger will be happy to sign books for you, and we can continue the discussion in the rear of the room. I'd like to thank Ambassador Gandalovic and Mr. John O'Sullivan for joining us. Most of all, I would like to thank and congratulate John O'Sullivan for his creation of this wonderful work of art. We are adjourned.